All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. Once again, you are joining the Building Partnerships that promote safety and security for places of worship and community spaces. I will be your facilitator for today, Marcus Coleman. A few technical notes. One, this is a closed press call, so this is an informational call only and not intended for press purposes. Two, closed captioning is provided. You can access the live transcript and closed captioning will be available. Three, this webinar will be recorded. So for those of you that may not be able to stay for the full time, or if you have friends and colleagues that have not been able to join, if they register for the webinar, they will receive a recording of this webinar as well. Please place your questions using the Q&A button. That is going to be the place to post the questions that you have. The chat function will be turned off for the remainder of the call for attendees, but you can definitely put your questions in the Q&A pod and we will get to those as we're able. If you go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. This webinar is going to be looking at a government perspective on building faith-based and community partnerships. Some of you that have been with the Center for Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships for some time, we've had Faith Voices provide perspectives. This is going to showcase some very important partnerships from a state, local, and District of Columbia perspective. And a presentation from our colleagues at DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Next slide, please. And I would now like to introduce our Executive Director at the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, Melissa Rogers, for her opening remarks. Melissa, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this call today. And on behalf of President Biden, I want to just warmly welcome you to this call and extend a very deep word of thanks to each of you for the work that you do to keep us all safe, including in sacred spaces and other places where community members gather. First, we want to note that those impacted by Hurricane Fiona and the coastal storms in Alaska continue to be much on our minds. We know it is an incredibly difficult time for so many in these areas, and we'll continue to monitor and do everything we can to address these concerning situations. We also want to offer a special word of thanks to those of you who are contributing to the response efforts in these areas. We're so grateful that you could join this important discussion today, building partnerships that promote safety and security for places of worship and community spaces. This webinar is part of our National Protecting Places of Worship Week of Action, ably led by Marcus Coleman and Nicole Wood and the team of the DHS Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. We're so grateful to them for all that they have done to make this week a really impactful one. We know that it is so important that people are able to feel safe and secure in sacred spaces and in other spaces, of course, where people gather. And of course, this requires informed perspective. It requires partnership and identifying resources that we can share that help to, avoid targeted violence and other threats to sacred spaces and other places of gathering. And of course, when I say partnership, that means that it really requires teamwork. Teamwork by the federal, state, and local government, and also teamwork with civil society, including everyone on this call. We cannot do our work without one another. So this is so important for us to be in conversation and for that conversation to continue. Just want to stress that there'll be time for conversation today on this call, but Marcus will also give you information about how to stay in touch with us in other ways, because we know that there's no teamwork without two-way conversation that's ongoing. We present information to you, you present information to us. We continually talk and share that information to make this effort as strong as it could possibly be, because it really does need to be a whole of society effort. So the purpose of this webinar is to highlight multiple ways that we can bolster our partnerships to enhance the safety and security of these institutions and communities. And that engagement certainly continues and highlights our commitment to protect the right to practice faith without fear for everyone. And we've been very busy and continue to be very busy implementing directions from President Biden about safeguarding faith-based communities. I'm proud to co-chair the Protecting Places of Worship Interagency Policy Committee, and we're working on a number of fronts, including the President's call for increasing amount of resources being poured into programs like the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, and to make sure that that program is equitable. So we are pleased to be able to share some more information with you about our work, and of course, as I said earlier, to hear your ideas about how we can do this work even more effectively. We also are especially pleased today that you will hear from important partners at a state and local level on ways to bolster partnerships that improve the safety and security of your local community. And let me just extend a special word of thanks to the state and local speakers who are joining us on the call. And with that, let me just once again thank our moderator and convener and leader of the Protecting Places of Worship Week of Action, the first of its kind, Marcus Coleman, the director of the DHS Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Let me thank him and all of you, and we look forward to the continuing conversation. Marcus, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and grateful to have you with us to provide those opening remarks. Minnie, if you can go to the next slide, please. So that's who I am. We're going to go on to the next slide so you could get to our partners. So first, we have a special presentation from a state that has done a lot of great work to develop tools and resources that I think, while they're definitely applying to New Hampshire, can be leveraged across the country. Dr. Christensen and his team have done phenomenal work, and I'm so grateful that they can provide a presentation about some of the ways that they are engaging as a state to help support faith-based and community groups looking to increase preparedness in their communities. Dr. Christensen, over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Directors Coleman, Director Rogers, appreciate the privilege and opportunity. Thank you one and all for taking your time out of your busy days to participate in a very worthwhile conversation. Really, really do appreciate it. And right out of the gate, you've heard the word already multiple times, partnerships. And that's right where we are going to start today regarding that. You know, there is a misunderstanding kind of in society. There's a certain time and a place for separation of church and state. And indeed, that's been part of our culture. And there's a time and place, as mentioned. But it's also done, I think, some barrier building when indeed we need to be breaking some barriers down. And, you know, one of the things recently took a class relative to faith communities and response at times of disasters. And we heard from the instructors how that during Hurricane Katrina, the response from the faith community just showed the incredible power of when dedicated assistance is available. And so it is, it's just a delight to partner with faith communities, small, large, at every level. You know, here in New Hampshire, we did purpose a number of years ago to continuously try to remove this barrier of separation of church and state when it comes to preparation, emergency preparedness. Indeed, I happen to be the chief of preparedness and response here at New Hampshire Homeland Security Emergency Management. And it is critical. It is critical that every person be able to make their world safe, starting at their own house, houses of worship, right up through every level of society here in New Hampshire. And indeed, we work together with our Region 1 or FEMA Region 1 states, New England, really trying to help encourage each other along these lines. Here in New Hampshire, one of the things we've been trying to do is leverage the nonprofit security grants that come down from the federal government. And we do that right to houses of worship. And we do this on a application based. They are to do a self-assessment. We've got the forms right on our website, our resource center. You'll hear me refer to a couple times. And we not only encourage, we expect that they will have worked with their local first responders. This is very critical so that when we receive an application, they are vetted, if you will, with some thought pertaining to kind of where we need to go. The next slide, if I could, as we go along. And actually, the next slide, please. The phrase here on top, I get by with a little help from my friends. One of the things that the government is unfortunately infamous for is the silo effect. It can hinder our responses, and it's no different with faith communities. Again, we purposed here in New Hampshire to avoid the silos. We're pretty blessed to be, I'll say, a condensed area of the country, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and we try to share resources. And so here in New Hampshire, you see here on your screen a couple of the key stakeholders. Right out of the gate, 4 or 5 years ago, we had our director, then our director, Jen Harper, who just recently retired, fully endorsed this. And you'll see, for instance, we had the U.S. Attorney's Office. A gentleman who was previously a SWAT commander in Revere, Massachusetts, was on board with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We had full blessing of that office to help. You see CISA, Jason Clymer, who is the Special Protection representative for New Hampshire. We work closely. We continue to work closely with Jason Clymer. Here in our shop, if you will, Homeland Security, we have Steve Cooper, for instance, a retired state trooper, and then faith community leaders. So when you look at these stakeholders, and you can kind of envision in your own world and in your sphere, if you will, you can see, at the state level, in our case, or at the local level, you can kind of fill in the blanks with some of the names that you can build partnerships with to break down those silos, and particularly the faith communities that the leaders have been so encouraging. The Jewish community here in New Hampshire has been phenomenal, really sharing their resources on hardening their facilities, and no matter what the faith is, just putting it out there, laying it out there in our online seminars, etc., them encouraging other faiths on how to properly put an application together for these security grants. Next slide, please. One of the things that's a problem in our society, when all that's been said and done, a lot of times more has been said than done. You've heard that before. Well, and I've often heard this, and I remember coming up through seminary and, in the early days of my ministry preparation, people do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. So my question to us, and then by extension yourselves, is, so how do we really show care in a tumultuous world? We could take the next 10 hours talking about all the things, if you will, that are challenging in our world. But it's really incumbent upon us to build these critical bridges. And so look at these bridges, if you will, and they are present in your sphere. They're present here in New Hampshire. And we have really tried to highlight these bridges. So you've got the emergency management community. So in our case, that's the state, that's local, to the faith communities. We have hundreds and hundreds of people in our database, people who have asked to be part of our database, our faith communities database, and we work constantly with them. Then you have faith communities to the local first responders, or volunteerism. VOAD stands for Volunteer Organizations Active in Times of Disaster. So we're constantly, people are saying, how can I help? How can I help? Well, the biggest way is to be able to connect with first responders. Back in the day when I was a 23-year-old pastor who didn't know much of anything, all I knew the first thing to do was to reach out to my local police department and volunteered to be a chaplain. I started there and things went from there. You can do that. You can encourage. So faith communities to local first responders, faith communities to faith communities, and EM community to emergency management community. Next slide, please. So how do we get going, and what can you do there in your community? Borrowing from the exercise, training and exercise, all hazard, danger world here in emergency management, we're always talking about crawl, walk, run. Starting somewhere, starting with kind of, you've heard the phrase bloom where you're planted. Vision cast, identify stakeholders. Who can come alongside of you? Again, at the state level, there's a lot of assets. A lot of states, admittedly, a lot larger than New Hampshire is. But, so maybe it's at the county level. Wherever it's at, really identify stakeholders who are passionate. These people I mentioned before, the reason they were so successful here in New Hampshire is they are personally vested in their own houses of worship, in addition to what we're doing at the state. Crawl, walk. Include, implement, assess, revise, and then run. Go for it. Go for it. If your heart is in the right place, you've got the right stakeholders, you're not going to go wrong. You're going to make good things happen. Next slide, please. One of the things that I think is incumbent upon states to do, or larger counties, or even local agencies here when it comes to government, is be a resource hub. In New Hampshire, we use what's called the HSEM Resource Center. You could Google it. It comes right up. And one of the pages we have is the Houses of Worship resources. We want to make it easy to include emergency action plan templates, to include self-assessments relative to facilities. A lot of information is there. We got to do some updating to be sure. It's challenging to keep these things updated. But then you'll also note in the lower right-hand corner, there's DHHS's Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership Resources. So be a one-stop shop, but the critical thing is making sure you're tying folks back into the local first responders. Very important. Next slide, please. And so taking a look at this, what are some of the products that we've been working on for about 5 years? Emergency preparedness seminars that we go out and we do 3-hour emergency preparedness, civilian response to active shooter events, and emergency operation plans. We'll be doing this again next Sunday in Manchester. Hate crimes, human trafficking panels, bringing in subject matter experts. 3-hour tabletop exercises where we validate first responder and faith community emergency action plans, targeted conferences. And during COVID, we started the online seminars, which brought a lot of information to our faith communities, which is very important. Next slide, please. So it does take all of us. This is my final slide. And, you know, I just kind of put a thought up here, whether here in New Hampshire, it's first in the nation primary. Hart's location is where the first casts are cast. Votes are cast. Population 44, Hartford, Connecticut, Hartford City, Indiana. Wherever you are going, you know, it's just the numbers of people don't matter from the tiniest hamlet right up to the largest metropolis here in America. Lives matter. Emergency preparedness matters. And it really does, again, start and end with partnerships. And again, I'm very thankful for whether it's our legislators who are supportive, our senators, our representatives, our governor, right on down to our director. And so with that, I'm going to conclude the time that's been allocated to me. It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Dr. Christensen, thank you so much. And I appreciate you touching on a lot of different aspects, but I think there's 3 key things that I walk away, well, technically 4, but I'll cover the 3. I think the first you mentioned, sir, the importance of working with your insurance company, as well as a local and state first responders. I really appreciate that point. Also really value that the available resources through the portal at the state level that's available for anybody. And then the third thing that you talked about in terms of like, right, knowing that the team can start from where they are, bloom where you're planted, as you said, all very valuable points. The fourth point, I didn't know you were a pastor before, so looking forward to staying in touch with you to learn more about your journey from the work as a pastor into emergency management. So thank you very much, Dr. Christensen.
Thank you, one and all.
Absolutely. Well, we are going to keep the conversation going, and I am so honored to introduce a panel of 3 here in the District of Columbia. We have Dr. Chris Rodriguez, who served as the Director for DC Emergency Management. Dr. Rodriguez, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome. And then he will be joined by Deputy Chief Tony Goodman and Reverend Thomas Bowen. Mr. Goodman, how are you?
Doing well as well. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thanks
All
for having me.
Absolutely. And Reverend Bowen, thank you for joining us also.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. So listen, you all are in for a treat some more. Hope you got some ideas from the state perspective for the state of New Hampshire. We'll now hear, I will pass it to Dr. Rodriguez to guide us and his team through the next presentation from the District of Columbia. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Marcus. And if we could bring up our slides, please, that'd be great. Thank you. So, well, at least here in the District of Columbia, good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you about what we're doing in the district. Just a little bit really quickly about my agency that I now lead as an appointee of Mayor Bowser. DCHCEMA, the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, really has a very broad mission including planning and coordinating our efforts to ensure that the district is prepared to prevent, protect against, respond to, mitigate, and recover from all threats and hazards. And that includes a variety of different functions that reside within our office. Not only do we house the district's 24/7 watch center, but we also do so on behalf of the National Capital Region. As an emergency management agency, we're very unique in that we do also house the district's Intelligence Fusion Center, where we have roughly 24 analysts looking at a variety of all threats and hazards. We also have a very strong preparedness program across our entire system, as well as training and exercises. And of course, as the emergency management agency, we do host the district's Emergency Operations Center. Next slide. I'll turn over to Reverend Bowen.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, and thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Melissa. Since 2016, I've had the pleasure to serve as director of the Mayor's Office of Religious Affairs. I'm very grateful to Mayor Muriel Bowser for the opportunity. The Mayor's Office of Religious Affairs was established in 1973 through the District of Columbia Home Rule Act, and it collaborates with the Mayor's Interfaith Council, which is comprised of 30 individuals from around the District of Columbia, who provide outside input into partnerships and other issues and concerns to the faith community. One of our primary goals is to increase the involvement of the faith community in alignment with the goals of Mayor Muriel Bowser, which is to create pathways to the middle class. This can be seen in our objective to produce 36,000 more units of housing, 12,000 with the earmark for affordable. We've been working with houses of worship to try to get them to use some of their excess property and land to build affordable housing units for the residents of Washington, D.C. The Office of Religious Affairs, which I lead, is comprised or located in the Office of Community Affairs. I also happen to lead the Mayor's Office of African American Affairs and the Commission on Father, Men, and Boys. But some of the other offices in religious and community affairs, which does delve into the work that I do along with HSEMA, are the Office of LGBTQ Affairs, the Office of Latino Affairs, and the Office of Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. Next slide, please.
So the district's Interfaith Preparedness and Advisory Group was founded in 2019 to help faith-based organizations be more prepared and resilient to all types of hazards. We do this by encouraging communication and dialogue between district agencies and organizations. IPAG is primarily a joint effort between the Mayor's Office of Religious Affairs, HSEMA, and our Metropolitan Police Department. There are currently over 100 faith-based organizations signed up as IPAG members. And of course, we also coordinate very closely with other agencies, including our partners at Department of Homeland Security and others at the national level. Next slide, please. We take an all hazards approach to preparedness. This includes violent acts, but also anything else that could be disruptive to our communities. For example, for flooding and storms, we're fortunate that few DC neighborhoods are likely to be directly impacted by river flooding. However, flash flooding during heavy rains can occur in many locations. Winter storms are also a threat here in DC, but there often isn't anywhere to shovel or store snow. The important consideration that we keep in mind is that faith-based organizations and houses of worship are in every neighborhood and are directly impacted, provide support, or both in all incidents. Next, please. Beyond storms are our local planned and unplanned events and incidents. Throughout DC, every week we have festivals, races, concerts, and more. There are also localized outages, crashes, and incidents that can happen anytime. Hazards can come from these events directly, or sometimes from threats of violence associated with events, protests against events, or others. Well, in addition to violence, road closures themselves can impact parking, access, emergency response for our houses of worship. For any and all events and incidents, it's essential that we communicate risks to the faith community and work with them to mitigate those risks. Next slide, please.
One of the things, in addition to what Tony was saying, is a lot of the very national events that occur throughout the country are really, in many respects, sort of focused here in the District of Columbia. So for July 4th in particular, we have multiple parades and events going on across the city, on the mall, and in different localized neighborhoods. One of the things that we always have to plan for, of course, is some of the unknown events that can occur. And you see here an example of a small tornado that actually touched down on the mall and impacted other parts of the region in 2021, which kind of made the city have to sort of work with our federal partners to make sure that we were prepared for that event. Every 4 years, of course, we have a presidential inauguration. We have State of the Union addresses that happen. Again, a lot of this requires a lot of coordination with our federal partners, but in particular, we want to make sure that our faith community, to the extent that these events do impact their communities, have all the information they need, again, to keep their congregations and their neighborhoods safe, and to just make sure that we're communicating with them on a regular basis. Next slide. Also, we see some again, unknown events, at least to the left, that can happen at times here in the city. On the left, you do see the brand new Frederick Douglass Bridge, which opened within the last year. We actually had someone who scaled up to the top of it, protesting the recent Supreme Court decisions in the last few months, and actually stayed up there for a couple days. And there was an inflatable cushion there that police department had to put out. The individual was taken down safely after a couple days. And then, of course, to all of us, for a lot of people across the country, 2020 was a very tough year. Here in DC, after the 2020 elections, we did see a lot of social protest activity and demonstrations here in the city that did go all the way back to the late spring and early summer of 2020. Again, during these times, it was absolutely critical for us to communicate to our faith-based community. A lot of these protests that we saw, particularly in the summer of 2020, impacted their communities in terms of some of the race-based protests that we saw. So again, we want to make sure, again, that we're communicating through the Interfaith Preparedness and Advisory Group. Next slide. And the way that we do this really is through our Fusion Center, through our 24/7 Watch Center, and we are always and constantly and continually monitoring for threats, not only in the open source and the unclassified space, but also with our federal partners, making sure that we have access to classified information. And our federal coordination, as I mentioned, is absolutely essential because whenever something happens across the country, we need to make sure that that information is getting to us as a city. And then we're also, to the extent that we can, share that with our faith-based communities in particular, because these regional, national, international events do have impacts to us. We do set up emails, we do regular calls. As you know, as many of the participants on this webinar know, we have seen shootings, for example, at religious institutions. And when that happens, tragically, we really want to make sure that we're communicating through the IPAG, convening calls, doing in-person meetings, webinars, emails, notices, to make sure that we're proactively pushing out information to make sure, again, that those constituents have the latest information.
I want to add to this, I guess, Dr. Rodriguez, just how instrumental ACEMA has been to the faith community. It's been said already, collaboration. Someone said it's amazing how much work can be done when you're not concerned about who gets the credit. And ACEMA has been a leader in that regard. As Dr. Rodriguez mentioned in 2020, and many of you on this can recall how there were several houses of worship that were violated. Two, being Asbury United Methodist and Bishop Powell's AME Church, which had the Black Lives Matter signs, which violated. But one of the first calls I received was from HC, who had information, who had then also made communication with our police department, who made sure that they met me on the scene at both of those institutions. And to say that those communities were made to feel all the better because of their presence is an understatement. And we tracked that not only from December, but to arrest and to conviction. And we made sure, as Dr. Rodriguez has said, that we had calls to ensure and to make sure that our faith community knew what the threat level was and that we were actively on the scene.
Thank you, Reverend Bowen, and certainly appreciate the relationship with Maura. One last thing I want to add, and you have some contact information for us there, is the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, and many of you in your communities benefit from that program. I encourage you to make sure that you're working with your faith-based communities to help them either with technical assistance on the grants, to help them and to help them administer them as well. It's just a great program, and we really appreciate it. It definitely benefits our faith-based communities in the district and in the National Capital Region. So there's our resources and contact information. Thank you very much, Marcus. I'll turn it back to you.
All righty, thank you all very much. And I want to just note, I think some common themes between the two presenters. So I think you heard Dr. Christensen refer to, right, it's the governor, it's legislative executives, it's a lot of people involved providing that leadership support, but it's the community. And Dr. Rodriguez and team talked about that as well. The other piece I appreciate between the two presentations thus far is, right, I think one of the things that's key for any government entity at the local or state level that's looking to find some convening spaces. I'm hoping that this seeds some ideas, particularly that Interfaith Preparedness Advisory Group. And I really appreciate kind of hearing some specific ways that the faith community is connected year round. Now, we've heard from colleagues from the state level. Again, when we talk about the state and territory level, the District of Columbia is a territory and a city as well. So it kind of provides that very local aspect. But as was mentioned, there's a lot of national things that occur in the area. But we wanted to make sure that we were also providing a perspective from the county level. And if you're following geography, we've started in New Hampshire, we've stopped in DC, and now we are going to Chatham County, Georgia next, where one of my favorite people in emergency management, Chelsea Sawyer, has been leading efforts for quite some time to do faith-based and community engagement at the county level. Her leadership, Mr. Jones, the emergency manager, and a lot of the county executives and officials have been champions of their work as well. And so excited, Chelsea, to have you here with us, and looking forward to you sharing your presentation on, from a county perspective, how you're building relationships with faith-based and community groups.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Director Coleman. And what an introduction. I'm going to write that in my journal and never forget it, that Director Marcus Coleman, I'm one of his favorite people in emergency management. Thank you. That's incredible. You go ahead and move on to my next slide. Perfect. So I am in charge of the Disaster Faith Network in Chatham County. This is an initiative that we started in 2018 with one of our previous employees, Michael Whitaker, who is now doing incredible work with the state of Virginia and their Department of Public Health. Really miss him, but understand that he has some incredible work to do up in Virginia. So if you'll go to my next slide, please. I really want to highlight our why and explain why we got into the Disaster Faith Network and why we're encouraging other local and county governments to get involved with the Disaster Faith Network and your disaster faith community. So first of all, we had several disasters back to back. I started 3 weeks before Hurricane Matthew, which was October of 2016. It was quite literally trial by fire in an emergency management agency and having a mandatory evacuation that our community had not seen in over 30 years. So that was a huge blow to our community and very, very detrimental. Almost immediately following that, we had snow and ice storms. Now, I'm speaking to people that are all throughout the United States. That may not be as surprising or detrimental to maybe perhaps my colleagues in New Hampshire and DC that just spoke. That was devastating to us in Savannah, Georgia, to have a snow and ice storm. And we had to accommodate, we had to figure out how we were going to support our community. Then we were almost again immediately hit by Hurricane Irma in 2017, and then another evacuation for Hurricane Dorian in 2019. All of this, every last one of these responses required our faith-based community to get engaged. But as you all have probably seen within your own communities, if there's no organization to bring these communities together, it's a lot of potential for duplication of benefit, a lot of duplication of services. We had the city of Savannah, which is our county seat, very heavily focused on, but we had outlying areas, Garden City, the city of Pooler, the town of Thunderbolt, that were really struggling to try to get resources. And those communities didn't fare as well as the city of Savannah did itself. So we wanted to harness the power behind these houses of worship, and we wanted to make sure that we were moving our community forward and our entire community, not just certain portions of our community. So that was really our why for starting our Disaster Faith Network. Next slide, please. So now some buy-in and some recommendations. My highest recommendation, and this is coming from the Southerner on the call, if you feed them, they will come. We struggled for the first little bit of getting our Disaster Faith Network the feet that it needed to have to be successful until we started feeding them. We would provide breakfast for morning meetings. We would provide lunch for lunchtime meetings. It doesn't have to be overly complex. We've partnered with the Salvation Army in the past. We have an incredible relationship with our Salvation Army, and they could cook a lasagna or 5, and we were able to feed a lot of those houses of worship leadership that came to our meetings. Please, please, please be aware of dietary preferences with this. I learned a lot about dietary preferences over the last couple of years while doing this. You have kosher and you have gluten-free and you have vegan. Make sure that you have options that are available to everyone. And people are also very, very generous of, hey, I understand this time, if you could please have something for me in the future. But take that lesson. I've already learned it. I promise you, you'll be very successful if you take that. And this gives you an opportunity to offer first responders and emergency management the chance to speak. I full-time work in the emergency management agency. I'm always out doing presentations. I would have killed to have an opportunity to be able to get in front of a group of faith-based leaders, get in front of a group of people that wanted to make a difference within our community. So now I get to offer that to other organizations. I'm working with all kinds of different agencies across our county, across our state, and beyond, so that they now have this audience that they want that information out, and our faith-based leaders want that information to come in. And now we're just matching those two together. It's a fantastic way to really make those partnerships and those connections. Next slide, please. All right, resources and activities. First, ask your houses of worship, what do you want to know more about? I was shocked with some of the things that came back. I have never had the opportunity or really the need to write a grant, but that was an entire workshop that our faith-based community said, we need to be able to write grants. We want to go after the nonprofit security grant program. We want to write local grants. So our upcoming in 2023, our workshop is going to be solely focused on grant writing and how we can make sure that our houses of worship are ready to go after that grant application and be able to have a successful grant summary come back. Tap into your local, state, and federal resources. I know we've already heard from a state emergency management agency. We've talked about CISA. CISA has played a very, very big role in helping our organization flourish. We also have upcoming webinars and in-person summaries from the U.S. Attorney's Office talking about human trafficking. We'll figure out what your interest level is from your houses of worship. It will take you in all kinds of incredible different avenues. And then one that's fun, the Office of Commissioner of Insurance and Safety Fire. I always mess up the name of that, but it's your Department of Insurance. I never thought that that would be an easy connection, but your houses of worship have to have very specific types of insurance. They have casualty loss insurance that I had never even heard of. So talking with an insurance agent, talking with your Department of Insurance, and bringing those resources together is going to be very, very beneficial for you. and then plan activities around current events and areas of concern. Dr. Rodriguez just spoke from DC Emergency Management, and I literally took a screenshot of his quote. Only when our faith-based organizations are safe can they help meet the needs of your community. And that's huge. If they don't feel safe, if they don't feel like they can respond to an emergency event, they don't feel like they're safe within their own house of worship, they're not going to be able to respond in your community. So figuring out what they need to know, what your houses of worship need and want to know more about, is going to make all the difference. We did an active shooter preparedness workshop in July and had over 100 people attend, which was phenomenal numbers for a county emergency management agency. Next slide, please. All right, tips and tricks for getting started. I've got 2 slides on this. Develop a budget for this. Make it a priority from the beginning. This was something I had to sit down in my director's office and say, look, I need a good budget, and I need you to find value in this from the very beginning. And it has been a slow up trickle, I'll say, but it's something that we set from the beginning and said, this is something we really want to prioritize. Rotate your meeting locations. Director Coleman was just talking about meeting locations, figuring out where you're going to go. We have bi-monthly meetings. Every other month, we go to a different house of worship. It gives that house of worship an opportunity to highlight the amazing work that they're doing. It gives that leadership the opportunity to say an opening prayer or any type of opening remarks that they feel comfortable or in aligns with their religion. It really just broadens everyone's horizons, and it allows you to visit places all throughout your community. Now, if you're a state agency, that could be a little bit more challenging, but it's also very exciting and encouraging to think, oh, well, I could go to the western part of the state. I could go to the eastern part of the state. And it kind of forces you to move around a lot more than you normally would. Share information regularly. If you are not constantly sharing information with your faith-based organizations, they may forget that this resource exists, and they're not going to look to you during an emergency situation. If you're not sharing information and constantly getting out in front of them, they may just not remember. So keep your updates consistent, and then feel free to share information. The amount of things that I share from Director Coleman's office is a little bit embarrassing, but they're sending out information all the time. Why not push that on to your local houses of worship as well? Next slide, please. Update your contact information regularly. Leadership in your houses of worship, faith-based organizations, like every sector in this day and age, they change regularly. There is some pastors and reverends that rotate just part of their religion. So keeping that up to date, keeping your list up to date is definitely going to be recommended. At every event, highlight how houses of worship can get engaged in what you're doing. I speak from an emergency management agency perspective. I have a slide picture of shelter cots. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for how we can have this mutually beneficial relationship with our houses of worship. Talk about what they can do. Shelter operations, donations, and distribution centers, how they can get involved, because more than likely they want to get involved. And then get proper documentation up front. Go ahead and iron out some of the details, sign your memorandums of agreement, your memorandums of understanding, and keep those on file. I promise you it will save you so much time in the long run, and you're not going to be scrambling when, I'm not going to say if, I'm going to say when you do have some type of disaster or emergency within your community. Next slide, please. That is all I've got to share with you today. I look forward to chatting in the Q&A if you all have any specific questions, or you're welcome to send me an email directly. Thank you so much, Director Coleman.
Thank you, Chelsea. And see, y'all, I told you, this is why. We got phenomenal people. And I will say, we have no right of authorship at the Center for Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships. We see ourselves as part of a broader team and draw as much information and inspiration from Dr. Christensen in New Hampshire, Dr. Rodriguez, Reverend Bowen, Mr. Goodman, and Chelsea and team. The emergency management community, just so thrilled to have these presentations today. As she mentioned, you can drop your questions in the chat, and there's been some exchange already. If you drop a question in that Q&A button and ask a question, we have people responding to questions in real time from across our subject matter areas. And so I think some key threads that I want to just tap on again. I think it was good to hear some consistency in terms of the type of partners that come to the table. And I'll say all three presenters talked about, and this is more so for our emergency management folks online, they're taking an all hazards approach. We're hoping for those that are members of the faith community, maybe you didn't know that these are ways that government can proactively engage with the faith community. You can take some of these insights and information back to your local government official or your local emergency manager if you're looking to start a conversation. And then the third piece that Chelsea touched on, again, I think is just a really important engagement opportunity. If you're a government entity, or if you're a faith entity, or you're part of a faith network, talking with your insurance commissioners at the state level and inviting in a conversation on how to think about insurance policies when it relates to disasters. Very important part of the conversation there. We're going to have one final presentation before we go to broad Q&A. And that is from our colleague, Susan Schneider, who is at CISA. You're actually going to hear a lot from Susan tomorrow as well. I am super excited. The presentation tomorrow builds on more in depth, some more of the how-to of what we've talked about today, specifically for houses of worship. But Susan, I'll transfer it over to you to walk us through the next presentation.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me too. Briefly, I wanted to talk about some of CISA's faith-based security resources. On this slide, you can see how to access CISA's faith-based resources, but I wanted to discuss with you several of them that will be applicable to you and helpful to you as you try to enhance the security of your faith-based community and nonprofit organizations. First, I want to start with the security self-assessment tool. This is a tool designed to be utilized by the non-security professional. It takes you through a series of questions that will identify the different areas that you may want to enhance and the areas that you are very strong in securing. It will provide a report for you that can help you with your investment justifications for the nonprofit security grant program. And it can help you to prioritize your assets and the areas where you want to enhance your security. It's a wonderful tool. Definitely use your security team to go through it, as it is a little lengthy and they can all pitch in to answer the questions. I wanted to talk about the power of hello for houses of worship. This is a great product. It talks about the Oh-No approach, which is observe your surroundings, initiate hello. And a lot of houses of worship already do that. That's one of their strengths in doing that open and welcoming environment. So you're just building on those strengths to identify potentially suspicious behaviors and indicators and initiating that hello while also maintaining a safe distance and being sure that you are keeping yourself and others safe while doing so. Then you navigate that risk of identifying suspicious indicators, suspicious behaviors, and then it's obtaining help. So utilizing your security team, utilizing 911 or local law enforcement to obtain help for any suspicious individuals or suspicious behavior that you would like to report. So that is the power of hello for houses of worship. We also have many other resources, active shooter preparedness resources where you can complete an emergency action plan for your house of worship or nonprofit organization. We have several tools, guides, videos in many different languages, since it has over 22 different translated languages, including American Sign Language. We have school safety best practices and a self-assessment there as well for the schools that are attached to your house of worship that can talk about enhancing your security. We also have security, personal security considerations that you yourself can take to ensure that you are enhancing your security and things to think about to mitigate the risk coming to yourself and to your congregation and fellow employees. I wanted to bring up the tabletop exercise packages. There are 2 exercise packages related specifically for faith-based organizations, and they come complete with a situation manual as well as a YouTube video that will help with delivering the exercise. So it really brings everything together. You can invite your community members, your local law enforcement, and other individuals to make it a whole of community approach to enhancing security. And so I wanted to talk finally about non-confrontational techniques. We have two resources. I talked about the power of hello for houses of worship, but we have one, just the power of hello. And that is the Ono approach, again, also in 18 different languages. And also we have a de-escalation series. That's 4 products related to recognizing the situation, assessing yourself and the individual who may be becoming a little bit more emotional, and then de-escalation, how to try to cool down the situation, de-escalate using behavioral techniques, body language, and using the power of language, and then obtaining help. So reporting through either your organizational method or calling 911 to ensure your safety. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Marcus. Please join us tomorrow to learn more about all these different resources and how to use them. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Susan. And as she mentioned, I know when we promoted 2 separate webinars. We need you to register for both. And so if you register today and haven't registered tomorrow, we get it. You may not be able to make it, but go ahead and register so that way you can get an access to the recording and the materials that are there. Thank you very much, Susan. We'll now open it to a broader Q&A. And so what we'll do is I've been perusing some of the questions through the chat. Let me answer some top line things for people first, and then I want to open up 2 questions to our panelists. So this webinar is being recorded. We will be providing copies of the slides, and there will be a transcript available as well for those that are that need that as well. We also will make sure that the PowerPoints that we provide, that all of the hyperlinks are connected. And so please know that if you missed any part of the presentation or want to get notes back, you will be able to get that information for sure. You can also continue to drop your specific questions in the Q&A button as we ask these questions. And our team, including the folks that are on, will work to get back to you as soon as possible. And so my first question is a bit more broad reaching. And I'll say, I think we heard some wonderful presentations, but I want to get one more piece of advice. Dr. Christensen, let's start with you first. I know that you talk to a lot of emergency managers. I'm sure you've had some people at the local level and at states maybe come to you for advice on kind of what's one good step to get started. If you were talking with let's say like a town or a county emergency manager, what's a piece of advice that you would offer for them if they were looking to get a program started in terms of engaging faith-based and community groups?
I would absolutely ask the question and identify, again, we talked about stakeholders, but don't assume that the needs are necessarily all common, that a church is a church, a mosque is a mosque. That is just absolutely not true. Needs are very different. You've got urban, rural, what have you. Think about, for instance, the cybersecurity in and around contributions, et cetera, during COVID. So I would absolutely, I guess, develop a if you will, a focus group of representative houses of worship that you can just start to have coffee with. We literally had coffee with people and began to ask questions, and then we started identifying. We don't have to be the subject matter experts. Often we're not. We see ourselves as conduits, liaisons. So that's what I would recommend right out of the gate, no matter what level you're on, is developing a focus group of people and begin to ask questions. The one thing you do know is kind of where all these folks are at in your sphere. So it's connecting them to the right people and asking the right questions of the right people.
Excellent, thank you. And for DC Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency and the District of Columbia broadly, let's take it from the opposite perspective. What advice would you have maybe for a faith leader or a community of faith leaders that maybe they haven't really thought about working with government in this way? But what's some advice that you would have for those faith leaders that are looking to find a way to build partnerships towards government as they move forward?
Hey, Reverend Bowen, this is Chris. Why don't you start off with that? Maybe I could start. Sorry, I'm having connectivity issues, so my video's off. But I think for faith leaders, really sort of internalizing the value of having the relationships with public safety and emergency management. And while I know that at times that can be, you can sort of enter into those relationships kind of cautiously, there are real sort of deliverables that public safety and emergency management can bring to your community. And we mentioned the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We certainly in the District of Columbia help our subrecipients manage that grant, apply for it. But also just the information sharing and the awareness. Sometimes it's, there's so much information coming at us when something happens, either nationally or internationally. Going to your local authorities and just saying, hey, my congregation is scared about this. Can you come and talk to them? On the flip side, I like Dr. Christian was saying, just pick up the phone and you'll find that a lot of people are more willing to cooperate and coordinate with you than you think. And sometimes it's just about initiating that contact. Thank you, Marcus.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rodriguez. Mr. Goodman, anything you wanted to add?
Well, I think that covers it very well. I think, important thing to remember is, in an emergency, during a major incident, everyone's going to want to talk, and building those relationships ahead of time makes it a lot easier to do that. It's really the only way.
It is. And what I appreciate, and I think everybody kind of talked about this too, is starting with some of those just natural good events to use to plan and have conversations. So 4th of July parades, picnics, festivals, and I know that you all talked about that a lot from the district. There's a lot of opportunities, but we know every jurisdiction, right, has their big town event, town festival, farmers market, using some of those natural things that happen year round to help kind of keep that conversation open. I appreciate that. And then Chelsea, for you, I'd love to get your perspective as you work within leadership. So this is going to be, maybe there's an emergency manager on the line, or they're in an emergency management agency, but they're not the EM director, right? Or maybe buy-in isn't quite there internally. What are some recommendations that you would have for maybe a local emergency manager, local first responder that's seeking to get internal buy-in on, even exploring the idea of building partnerships in this way?
Sure. So kind of a little funny, the thing that first pops into my mind is internal buy-in is given when there's external pressure. So that's kind of my first piece of advice, is figuring out what resources exist within your community. How can you maybe not necessarily jump into creating your own disaster faith network, but how can you jump into existing organizations? Is there a pastoral alliance that you can just start having conversations with? Very similar to what Dr. Rodriguez said. Can you start having coffee on a consistent basis? If you start that relationship, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to then take it to your leadership and say, hey, I've been meeting with these faith-based organizations and there's a need here. There's an opportunity for us to really connect with our community. I think any emergency management director, any public safety director ultimately wants to connect with the community in a positive way. And I think that this is one way to definitely do that in an extremely positive way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I know we had a few questions, and we will definitely get to these in the coming webinars. So there will be webinars about the Nonprofit Security Grant and some of our other DHS grant programs in the very near future. Tomorrow's webinar, there were a few questions about, are there any hands-on trainings or any things that can be done at the church? That's exactly what tomorrow's webinar was about. So definitely stay tuned for that. And we have a number of already previously recorded webinars on a number of topics as well. But we are at the conclusion of this webinar. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and want to make sure that if there's some additional feedback you want to provide, if there's a question that you have, we will keep the question pod open to answer as many open questions as possible. But ultimately, if you have any additional questions, feel free to send me an email at partnerships@fema.dhs.gov. I see every email that comes into that inbox along with every member of my team, and we will do our best to respond to as many additional questions as possible. As I mentioned, you will get a recording of this webinar, you will get the PowerPoint, you will get key links that were shared from our partners. And so grateful for you all able to joining us today, and grateful for those able to register and joining us tomorrow. So as I mentioned, we will answer the remaining questions in the Q&A pod. Thank you all very much for joining the webinar this afternoon, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care.